Welcome to the Great British Foreign Affairs Podcast, hosting insightful conversations with fascinating people to shape the way that Britain interacts with the world. In this episode, I welcome back Peter Apps, journalist, author and defence expert, and we talk about the first big foreign policy moments for the new UK Labour government against the background of this week's 75th NATO summit in Washington. So, Pete, I'm so happy to have you back. You are becoming almost our resident defence expert, which I love. You're here to talk about the NATO summit, and also we will cover a few of the Labour frontbenchers' first things that they're doing on foreign policy. But first, could you just introduce yourself for people that are listening to the podcast for the first time?
Hi, so my name's Pete Apps. I'm a columnist for Reuters. I've spent 20 years with Reuters news agency, much of it as a foreign correspondent. I also help run a pop-up think tank called the Project for Study of the 21st Century. I am a British Army reservist, and I'm also a member of the Labour Party.
Yes, so Labour Party landslide victory at the end of last week. Interestingly, when David Lammy went round the news channels on election night, he very clearly presented the first thing that Keir was going to be doing on the world stage. That's how he framed it, as that, didn't he? So NATO summit this week in Washington, Keir's first presence on the world stage. And then he linked that to the UK hosting the European Political Community Summit, the fourth summit, which is in the UK at Blenheim Palace on the 18th of this month. And so these two things are being framed as Labour's first action, I guess, presence and message to the world, which is going to be really interesting to then pick apart and understand more about that. Of course, the NATO summit is incredibly important on a global scale. So really interested to get your takes on that. And we also have to note that David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, and John Healey, Defence Secretary, quick off the mark to visit countries, right? And to David Lammy visiting Germany, Sweden and Poland already. John Healey has been in Ukraine. And so these are significant postures and positions that the UK is taking in order to send the messages that the new Labour government wants to send. So, Pete, just please tell us your thoughts about the NATO summit this week, and within that, what the Labour Party, the new Labour government will want to be doing there on behalf of the UK.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting on a bunch of levels. So I think normally when a new government comes into power, their first priority is to start getting legislation on the books, and that takes a bit of time. And foreign policy comes down as sort of crises happen and opportunities happen. And what's happening here is the other way around. So partly because of the timing of the election, partly because it was called when it was, we have these big ticket events immediately after. And that's one of the reasons why we've also seen this sort of frantic bit of diplomacy over the weekend, because the new Labour government had literally only about 72 hours. People will start flying into Washington on Monday and Tuesday. And I think very sensibly, they have decided that they want to get their first meetings in before that summit takes place. And that's why, and I think the countries that both Lammy and Healey have visited are really interesting. I think first visit to Germany was to David Lammy meeting the German foreign minister. I think that's really interesting. Germany gets quite a lot of bad press for how slow it moves when it comes to foreign and defence things, particularly on supporting Ukraine and otherwise. Also in increasing its own defence spending. But it's also the kind of big heavyweight in Europe. And actually, if you look at what they've done in the longer term with Ukraine, they're the biggest backer in Europe, bigger than us when it comes to economic and military aid. They are delivering Patriot missiles, and crucially, they're getting their industry set up and running to build serious quantities of armaments, both for Ukraine, including within Ukraine, and also for the rest of Europe. And I think what you're seeing there, again, a social democratic government, there's an obvious kind of, if Britain and Germany can get on the same page, then that allows something of a counterweight to the political unpredictability of France, which we'll probably talk about in a moment. We just had the French elections over the weekend, and particularly the US. So that was his first port of call. He then went immediately to Poland. Poland now the biggest spender on defence per GDP as a percentage of GDP in Europe. Poland very much part of what it calls the Weimar Triangle with Germany and France. Poland, Germany, and France view themselves as the big powers within the EU. So getting Britain alongside that, really important. And then the last trip is also really interesting. He went to Sweden, NATO's newest member. There are a bunch of places he could have gone to as his third visit. And Sweden is an interesting one, not least because the Swedish approach to defence, what they call total society defence, has very much been adopted by the Baltic states. It's sort of the ideas that Germany and to an extent Poland are flirting with. I think talking to them in the run-up to the NATO summit is really interesting. I declare an interest. The Swedes hosted the launch of the US launch rather of my History of NATO, Deterring Armageddon, a couple of weeks ago. So I spent a bit of time with them, including their Foreign Affairs Committee, and I think positioning Britain as a more powerful version of Sweden is actually a really smart way to go. So if you look at Sweden, you've got a social democratic government, but you have relatively cross-party consensus on defence in a way that I think you probably see here between Labour and the Tories. Obviously, we're a more powerful country with a very different history. Sweden has more of an imperial history than it lets on, which again, it manages very well, I think, particularly in terms of conquering large swathes of Europe. And I think that's a really interesting kind of point. And then, of course, the fourth part of that is John Healey in Ukraine, because the Ukraine war is at a really critical phase. It looks likely that the Americans are going to be pulling back their support, particularly if Trump comes in. And getting the Europeans on the same page to support Ukraine is utterly critical, and bringing Ukraine into that European security infrastructure, which probably means the EU before NATO. So, getting Britain into all of those conversations is really important. And then he's going to fly out. He's already had his first call with Joe Biden. People like David Lammy have already been talking to various other people, including people who might be in the Trump administration. One of the things that's really important over the last few weeks is that the debate, as we all know, went badly for Biden. And that means that outside the United States, rather than there being a fair chance of a Trump administration, it's now seen extremely likely that there'll be a Trump administration. Now, if Biden does get binned by the Democrats, then clearly the new Labour government's going to want to reach out to whoever's going to be the new nominee. But in the short term, that means really talking to the people who are going to be around Trump. So all of that's going on at the moment. And then the NATO summit will be the kind of grand theatre where all of this plays out. And then you mentioned the European political community afterwards. That's, the EU plus, so there are other countries like Serbia and so forth becoming along. It was already going to be heavily about Ukraine. I think Keir's going to want to make it more about immigration as well. But again, that is going to be pitched very much as we got our the European states in the NATO summit are going to be sat down, and the US and to an extent the Asian states are going to say the risk of war in Asia with China is very real. That is the new US priority. The UK and Europe priority for that is getting Europe's defence in order. And making that work is going to be one of the things that happens at that European Political Community Summit. Last point, John Healey gave an interview to Politico on his first day in office, Friday or Saturday, where he was very clear that the UK is not going to be overly trying to do too much in Asia on defence because its priorities need to be Europe. That's a bit of a change from previous positions. It's a bit of a change from the position the Chief of Defence Staff wanted to take. But it's been received really well in Washington, including a guy called Elbridge Colby, who may well be Trump's national security advisor. Doing more stuff in Europe is exactly what the Americans want us doing. And Labour is trying to signal that it's very much going to be on message on that.
Yeah, and you talked about that in your podcast that we did at the end of last year, wasn't it? That actually that is what the Americans were asking the UK to do. So interesting that Labour has picked that up very quickly and is signalling that. Tell us more then about this summit this week. What do we expect to see, and what matters that is achieved? We should note, sorry, that you've just come back from Washington, haven't you? So this is really hot off the press information and intel.
Yeah, and I think it's always quite interesting to see how they're just sort of described differently in Brussels and elsewhere. The NATO summits, there's lots of kind of pre-politicking, which of course the Labour government hasn't been part of. It's been a part of it a bit. So at the Munich Security Conference, Keir had meetings with pretty much everybody. David Lammy has been all over the place, including in Washington, building relations with people. So there has been some pre-gaming. But on the other hand, there's a limit to how much you can do. Lots of people have commented how Keir looks different now he's in office, so does David. To an extent, it's sort of year zero moment. The big picture about the NATO summit, probably two or three things. Firstly, it's about Trump-proofing NATO. So Trump may come back in. Now, what he'll do is very unpredictable. First thing everyone watching will say, what Trump will do is very unpredictable. Don't expect anything from him. He won't definitely quit NATO. He won't definitely abandon Ukraine. He won't definitely do anything. But one of the big takeaways of that is that NATO is very keen to position itself as running the Ramstein process, which is the international system for delivering weaponry to Ukraine. So there's been a lot that will almost certainly get signed off. Viktor Orban has agreed to it, providing Hungary doesn't have to be involved. There'll be a new Secretary General, outgoing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. So he'll be getting his feet under the table. So that's important. There will be more sort of housekeeping about signing off the next generation of NATO's defense plans. There have been a lot of war plans drawn up since 2022 to defend Eastern Europe. They get more advanced every year, so there'll be a chunk of that. And there'll also be a meeting, and there'll also be the areas which get a bit more sort of touchy. So what happens about Ukraine's membership of NATO? Different nations say different things, but the Biden administration is very cautious. So the most they're willing to commit to is a well-lit bridge to NATO membership, which is a fairly meaningless phrase that's being put in the communique. I think Ukraine has accepted that's what they're going to get, but there will be sort of various sort of mood music around that. That is one of the reasons why getting Ukraine to the EU becomes more interesting. Really interesting that Kaja Kallas, she will now be outgoing Estonian Prime Minister, is now going to be the foreign policy chief of the European Union. She is one of the most outspoken sort of Russia critics. She's a hawk on Russia. Her grandmother was deported to Siberia in 1945 by the Russians. The fact that the head of foreign policy for the European Union is going to be her tells you a lot about where the European Union sits. She is very much in favour of bringing Ukraine into both the EU and NATO. She was a potential candidate for Secretary General, which was viewed as too hawkish for NATO. That tells you the EU may be punchier than NATO on this stuff. That's a real sea change. And again, something that Britain has to operate alongside. There are limits to how much we can shape it. What else is going on in Washington? The dynamics with the Asian nations are going to be interesting. Within Washington, people talk about 2027, the year by which Xi Jinping is according to the US intelligence, has ordered his military to be ready to attack Taiwan. The priority for the US, the Aussies, the Japanese, the South Koreans is getting that together. There is definitely a European part in that. You're seeing closer South Korean European defense relationships. There's a lot of sort of interesting stuff arising out of that. Poland is buying a lot from South Korea, for example. But again, I think when they sit in the secret sessions of the North Atlantic Council, the line will be, "This is a real threat," and there is a credible chance that if there is war in Asia, well, first, several things. The trick to stopping war in Asia is to deter it. The Americans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Aussies, obviously the Taiwanese are very much trying to do that. However, if it happens, particularly people like the Estonians have been on the record that the greatest moment of danger for Eastern Europe will be as that happens. And that means that even if you believe the most important thing to happen will be a Chinese attack on Taiwan, the European responsibility is to make a major Russian attack on NATO difficult, impossible, or to defeat it. And there's a whole bunch of stuff on which the Americans are willing to provide a degree of leadership. They have the top general in NATO. They're not going to stop having the top general in NATO. But when it comes to things like industry, human capital, the Europeans will become more important. And the last point I would say is that I would characterize deterrence in Europe as now having three components, maybe four. The first, obviously, is the nuclear deterrent component. The French have the most credible deterrent in Europe. They also have a tactical nuclear capability. They've been testing that very publicly. They've been talking about that becoming the EU's nuclear deterrent. Obviously, the Brits have our own. But that's a very much a kind of end of the world type thing. That doesn't get you all the way. The second two parts are having enough industry to fend off a long war with Russia and having the human capital to fend off a long war with Russia. If you have those things, you may well never need to do them. And that's why people like the Germans are moving towards having the ability to introduce conscription in a crisis. And the fourth point is financial relationships and economic relationships. And different European countries have very different relationships. The Germans very much trying to keep the door open to relations with China, likewise the French. I think we'll try and do that to a certain point, but also very clearly building our capability to not be dependent on China. Solar panels, batteries, chips, all of these areas are areas where we're very dependent on China, in the case of microchips, Taiwan. So there's an element of kind of building a European resilience. Britain is not in the EU. It's not going to be in the EU. I suspect it doesn't want to be in an EU that is built around a single currency, maybe ultimately European conscription. But it does want to play a part in all of those things. It wants to have a defence industry that works. And all of those discussions will be sort of taking place around the outside of the NATO summit. And they'll be setting the tone for the next 10 years.
And Labour wants to nail down an EU-UK security pact, doesn't it? That was in its manifesto. That's important.
Yes, but I think it's also worth bearing in mind that people want to nail down the Labour government on things, particularly defence spending and what it's going to spend it on. Fairly fuzzy commitment, if we're honest, to 2.5% of GDP. It may well be that the NATO summit, in an attempt to get ahead of Donald Trump, commits to 2.5% of GDP being the new floor. That means Britain will immediately be in breach of that unless it declares an intent to meet it. Likewise, Germany. I suspect one of the discussions that happened between Lamy and his German counterpart is how to handle that. I don't know that either of them want to go to 2.5%, but they may not have a choice. Again, if Germany and Britain start to look like they're the weaker parties on defence, that will produce a much more balkanised Europe. It'll mean the French doing deals with Eastern Europeans. I don't personally think that's in anyone's interest. I suspect that the new Labour government won't. And I suspect a bunch of Labour backbenchers, particularly those from forces backgrounds, won't. If you're the new Labour government has a sort of honeymoon period in office, it's not going to face too much criticism from the Tories until they get a new leader in. If it goes short on defence in Washington, then I think it'll start getting clobbered pretty fast from the Tories, but also it'll discover it's got a rod to its own back in some of its own backbenchers, who will be fairly upfront at saying that Labour needs to do more. So I think there's quite a lot to sort of play for there. Again, how the UK deals with Europe, it's probably just a memorandum of understanding how we talk to each other in the short term. In the medium term, though, it needs to be about producing capabilities. It needs to be about sharing intelligence. There's some really thorny issues there. Obviously, most of British intelligence comes from our ability to share information with the Americans. We clearly want to share more with the Europeans, but we can't share American intelligence with the Europeans without the Americans agreeing to do so. Navigating that dynamic is going to be quite a big deal. Dan Jarvis, new security minister, he's going to own that portfolio. That intelligence piece, which is really important, taking over from Tom Tugendhat. Predecessor of that was Ben Wallace. That's been a really, really, really formative thing. That involves doing all the secret stuff. Dan has a background in Special Forces Support Group, which has been widely reported. So he's operated in that environment before. He's got good relations with people, particularly good relationships with Tom Tugendhat, who he served with in Afghanistan. So he'll pick up that portfolio. And again, we won't see most of the results of those negotiations, but they're actually quite important.
Yeah. And the other thing at home the Labour government has to manage is, of course, the press and the Brexit narratives that it's very easy to then start to have to counter with the closer relationship with Europe. So that's something the Labour government is going to have to be very good at this stage, to not let things take hold that will later be a problem for them. Can you just say a quick minute on where the Ukraine war is at the moment? Because it does really feel like, because it's a longer term conflict, people aren't following it as closely. And I know there'll be people that, aren't completely up to date on that.
Yeah, so I think the Ukraine war has been a really interesting story, right? So, February 2022, Russia invades, and the initial assumption from the US and Britain and the rest of Europe was that Ukraine would probably be taken over very quickly in a matter of days or weeks by the Russians. And so, all of the preparations, things like NLAW, the British anti-tank rocket that was sent, the Javelin, were designed to help the Ukrainians fight an insurgency. But the assumption was Zelensky would be sitting somewhere in Poland, running a government in exile. And the Ukrainians changed the course of history by not falling over and managing to hold Kyiv and managing to hold the line. And then everyone got very optimistic, particularly because Ukraine managed to take back a chunk of territory in the first year and started talking about, in terms of taking back all of its territory, people started to worry about what the Russians would do if the Ukrainians were able to retake Crimea and Sevastopol. Would the Russians go nuclear, that kind of thing. But everyone was quite optimistic and a lot more weapons started to flow. By 2023, it became clear that all of the Western ability to manufacture weapons wasn't enough to keep the Ukrainians in the game. So ever since the Cold War, the assumption has been that a large-scale, long-running conventional war was impossible because it would go nuclear, and then the Cold War ended. It just wasn't seen to be a possibility at all. The Ukrainians used up, I think, a third of all of America's Javelin and Stinger missiles in the first few months of the invasion. They used up a very large chunk of the West's artillery shells in the first year. More artillery shell production coming online, but not enough. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 wasn't as effective as people hoped. 2024, the Russian overmatch was becoming really quite obvious in terms of shells and reconditioned tanks. Another big shift in the last year is the rise of first-person viewer drones, which now injure and kill more people on the battlefield than artillery. So some really, really big shifts. As things stand, it could go either way. It's a real linchpin point. The Russians probably can't break through. They've been trying and they haven't succeeded. But if we don't give Ukraine enough support, that will change. They have dismantled a huge chunk of Ukraine's power infrastructure. If up until now has been keeping Ukraine in weapons, I think the trick for the winter is keeping Ukraine's power on, and that's where the European Union has a lot to offer. But we need to that's a really big game. Ukraine's power is probably going to have to be generated in Europe and piped in. The Ukrainians very keen to get weapons manufacture, weapons maintenance, and training on their soil. The Ukrainian ideal would be to have Lithuanian, Estonian, Polish, British, German troops in Ukraine, not on the front line, but repairing tanks, protecting infrastructure, to an extent stopping the Russians coming in from that northern border with Belarus. How close the Europeans are to agreeing that is very unclear. Macron was very up for it. Then, of course, he got a bit emasculated by the first round of the elections. Now the question is, where does Macron's discussions with the French left sit? Now, again, really important here, because if the French left can find common ground with Germany's Social Democrats here in London, and we can come up with an agreement amongst Europe's left, then Macron gets back in the game. But it'll be a Macron who's dependent on the left, and that's a very different kind of Macron. The position, there are two very different schools of thought on where we sit on Ukraine. The first, which was the predominant immediately after the invasion, is if we get too closely involved, we'll end up in a shooting war with Russia, and that may end the world. And therefore, avoiding that is the most important priority. And that was very much the Biden administration's position. The Johnson administration was willing to take a bit more risk. The Germans sort of held that view as well. The view in Eastern Europe now is very much that this war is now on. If we lose this war, or indeed if we stop this war, so if Trump does a deal with Putin over stopping the war on current borders, then the Russians have a limited period of time where they have quite a powerful reconstituted military, where they can reconstitute and where they will come back. In other words, if we're not ready for the Russians, they'll come in and they'll attempt to achieve the thing that no Kremlin has managed to achieve since 1945, which is grabbing a bit of NATO Europe, breaking the alliance, and setting open the door for a potentially quite unstable 21st century or 21st century from here. So that is gradually moving the consensus to the fact that we have to win this war now. And I suspect, looking at the expression on John Healey's face in Kyiv, one of the things a Ukrainian official said to me in Washington is, one of the things we've discovered is when we bring people to Kyiv, no matter where they stand when they arrive, they become much more passionate about defending. It's not very surprising. They see the graveyards. They see the people who look like us who are facing an existential war. So, I don't know where John Healey stood on support for Ukraine before the election. I'm pretty confident I know where he stands when he comes back from shaking Zelensky's hand. And don't forget, Healy's been the only man in that. Keir wasn't with him, right? He was the face of Britain with Volodymyr Zelensky, the Churchill of the 21st century, who's facing a lot of problems domestically at home, but is still, the man who has led a democracy through fighting off an existential war, looking him in the eye and saying, I can win this war if you give me items 1, 2, and 3. So he's probably going to come back with, David has been in Kiev on multiple occasions, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer is going to look to make his mark. And, again, he had his interaction with Zelensky on the D-Day beaches. Don't underestimate how important this stuff. Tony Blair became a completely different human being when he started doing foreign affairs. That completely rewired every aspect of his being and turned him into the Tony Blair that he is today. That's not uncommon.
Yeah, exactly. And that is also the power that the Baltics have in the conversation, the Estonians, the Latvians, when they're talking about Ukraine and when they interact with other world leaders, they have the power of persuasion and the deep understanding about the Russian threat in a way that others may not. And I think that interaction is also a very, very powerful one. And that's what you were saying earlier. I think that's so interesting what you're saying, that the foreign affairs, it's very noticeable in these last few days, isn't it? That, as you say, there's a complete transformation of Keir Starmer, of David Lammy, John Healey, and just seeing them in a completely different light. But also, we've said for a long time, haven't we, foreign policy doesn't matter in a domestic campaign, an election campaign, and it matters on day one of government. And there it was in all its glory, right? Let's just finish this then by talking quickly about the European political community, which, of course, may seem less important than the NATO summit, but because it's on UK soil, that's a real sense of pride, isn't it? It's also important because it was a brainchild of Macron. And you say Macron's then coming to that with this surprise election result in France of the left coalition, which of course is not his party, but his party came second. A lot of French people are quite relieved right now, aren't they? And so there will be something important about that summit held on UK soil and including a large number of countries, a larger number than are in the EU.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. Firstly, immigration, new border security command, all that kind of stuff. I think that's going to be important. But I think there's something here that's also really interesting, and it comes back to the French thing, and it's the idea of Europe. And it's really interesting having it at Blenheim Palace, birthplace of Winston Churchill, who first person ever to suggest a joint European army. Much more sort of real pro-European streak running through Churchill, but also, that's social democratic Europe. We talked about the Swedes visiting the Swedes. Someone said sort of slightly facetiously, we've all got that, let's reset the narrative. It's not the rise of the far right, it's the rise to the left. It's 1945 again. You've got Clement Attlee and Leon Blum in France, and the rise of a social democratic Germany. That you can overstate that, but I think one of the reasons why the Baltic states and Sweden and the Scandies are interesting is that they have a social contract that is very much something that is not far away from where, but this election has been about the NHS. It's been about the social welfare net. In Scandinavia, the Baltic states, that idea of being, European civic is very bound up with also having strong defences. And that's it goes back a very long time, go back to the real sort of Viking heritage, Anglo-Saxon Frid, the field army, where you would, have your shield in your hut and you would go off and defend the country when you need to, which of course, again, in Britain, we have going back to World War II, the Home Guard, Dad's Army. It's very much in our sort of DNA. And I think this idea that, confronting the far right and the authoritarians with saying, yes, there is this Putinist, Orbanist model, and we don't agree with it. What we stand for is a country where everyone pays their taxes and contributes to the defense of the realm, whether it's by paying taxes or doing whatever you do, and whether it's by and that is important. And I think there is a moment, and it'll be interesting to see how Macron grabs this, because Macron is very good at grabbing the kind of zeitgeist, and it doesn't take very much for Macron to channel that. I think, I'm actually really put in mind of the first days of the coalition government under Cameron, because there's something quite powerful about a summer new government. It looks optimistic. You've got, the Cameron Clegg Lib Dems working in the national interest, they were able to create a real zeitgeist then that lasted for 5 years and made people feel relatively good about the government and delivered, it's something that felt, able to rival and pick up the sort of Tony Blair things can only get better thing from 97. I mean, obviously the Tory party has massively lost that over a long period of time. But I think we are in a moment where you can do that. I think, the democratic transfer of power without people getting upset over it. The fact that Europeans have managed that in lots of elections, the US is probably going to have a messier time. There's a huge amount to be proud of about what's been achieved in European democracy, European social democracy with the small s. There's a sort of moment to do things now. Keir looks the part. He's not on his own. He's got the Germans to play with. He's got he's got Macron. He's got, in the medium term, whatever arises out of the Biden debacle in the US, which I hope will be a resurgence of younger people in the Democratic Party. I think Keir's country first, party second line has more resonance than possibly people initially thought. I think there's a moment of opportunity here, and the threat, which is incredibly serious. It's the greatest threat we've had since, if not 45, then the 60s or the 80s, but it's arguably the most dangerous and in flux moment since 1945. This is where leadership counts, and doing the right thing on a dark night, which is something that Britain has a reputation for, is something that we have an opportunity to do again. And my hope is that the new Labour government will grab that. Again, if it doesn't, last point, really interesting MPs elected. So lots going on. And I think quite a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And again, that's where these next 2 weeks are going to be critical.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say a bright moment for the UK, it feels like a difficult moment globally, but an interesting moment for NATO and Europe. So thank you, Pete. That's been absolutely insightful, enlightening, and we really appreciate it.
Pleasure as always.
Thank you for listening to the Great British Foreign Affairs podcast, where Britain meets the world. Subscribe today, share it with a friend or colleague, and be part of shaping Britain's role on the global stage.